Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been in the Middle East this week trying to revive talks for a ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza. Blinken has said that Israel's military has achieved its goal of effectively dismantling Hamas. Israeli forces killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar in Gaza last week. Israel and its allies say Sinwar was the architect of last year's October 7th attack on Israel, when Hamas killed about 1,200 people and took about 250 others as hostage. So what are the remaining barriers to a ceasefire? We have two different perspectives here. Dan Senor served as White House foreign policy advisor in the George W. Bush administration and has been a prominent supporter of Israel's war effort. Former CNN senior correspondent Arwa Damon is the founder of the humanitarian nonprofit group Inara, which operates in Gaza, among other places. Good morning to you both. Arwa, you have been in Gaza many times since this war. We're going to get to that in a second. But just to start with you, Dan, it has been a week since Sinwar's death. Is there any indication that Netanyahu is ready to see a shift in his strategy?
Well, I think there are two issues. One is, as it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the real question is whether or not there's any moderate force that will emerge out of Gaza among the Palestinians that will succeed Sinwar's reign on Hamas, his reign on Gaza, and be willing to actually try to build something there. Keep in mind, Israel left Gaza in 2005. Hamas and ultimately Sinwar and Mohammed Def and some of his other deputies turned basically Gaza into a military fighting territory and machine to wage war on Israel. Billions and billions and billions of dollars were sent to Gaza to try to develop Gaza, but it wasn't really developed into a self-sustaining entity, political entity that can serve the needs of Palestinians. It was turned into a war-fighting machine. So now that Sinwar is gone, because keep in mind, Sinwar was serving 4 life sentences in an Israeli prison, not for slaughtering Israelis, but for slaughtering Palestinians. Palestinians were terrified of him. The question is, now that he's gone, can some emerge? New York Times article after Sinwar was killed, they quoted this 22-year-old Gazan named Mohammed, who quoted here, Sinwar's death marked, and I'm quoting here, the best day of my life. He humiliated us, he started the war, he scattered us and made us displaced without water, food, or money. He is the one who made Israel do this. So the question is, are people like Mohammed, now that Sinwar is gone, willing to stand up in big numbers and actually produce an alternative to what Hamas has done to Gaza? And if that's the case, I think there's a real opportunity for some reconciliation.
Ara, what is your thought? Because you have been to Gaza many times in the last year. You work with Palestinians, you speak to Palestinians. What are they saying about his death?
Well, I mean, look, I think it's one thing to quote someone who's been quoted in the New York Times, and it's another thing to actually have a conversation with people directly. Now, what's been interesting is that even before Sinwar was killed, you know, you go to Gaza and you're talking to people. And one of the conversations that I had with a group of 20 and 30-year-olds was, and they had all been displaced. You know, their families were living in tents, open sewage running next to them, that constant buzz of the drones and the bombings. And they were saying, you know, there's one thing that actually does scare us, and there's a lot that terrifies Gazans, but that was, what if what comes after Sinwar is worse than Sinwar himself? We have to remember that Gazans did not necessarily support Hamas. If you look at polls conducted just before October 7th, had there been elections in Gaza, the Hamas candidate would have barely won 25% of the vote. We're talking about a very young, highly educated population that is being subjected to living in these conditions, and they are very well aware of their reality. Yes, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, but Israel also imposed a blockade on Gaza in 2007. We need to recognize that nobody inside Gaza can do anything without Israel's approval. Your water, your electricity, your access to the outside world is all dictated to you by Israel. And so the fear in Gaza is what is going to come after Sinwar. And after his death, I was speaking to a couple of my friends, and they were saying, for the first time, we had a little bit of hope that because Israel had taken him out, maybe we could move in a better direction. If we look at what has happened since then, it's just all getting worse.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind, you're talking about the Palestinians in Gaza as though they have no agency, that the Palestinians are just waiting to see what replaces Sinwar. The serious question is whether or not they can take their future into their own hands and say they're going to shape who succeeds Sinwar. And I just think this has been a problem. This has been a problem for the Palestinians going back almost a century, that whenever they're given an opportunity to build something on their own, whether it's their own state or their own, political jurisdiction or their own, government, quasi-government entity, they just sort of sit back and say, well, what's Hamas going to do? Sinwar's gone. Now what's going to succeed Sinwar? As opposed to saying, what are they going to build?
Well, I think it's easier to say that sitting in a studio and asking people to take control of their life when for the last year they have been bombed and displaced and had their infrastructure completely obliterated. And even prior to that, let's remember that the Gazans did try to stand up.
What about between 2005? What about between 2005 and 2023?
They did try to protest. They did try to stand up. Look, no one is saying that Hamas is, great. But at the same time, it's a bit convenient to say, oh, but it's the people's fault.
I'm saying, the question is, do they have agency? Do they have a role in their own future?
That's the problem, is that Gazans' agency has been taken away from them by multiple actors. And those actors include Israel, and those actors include Hamas.
Well, let me pose this question to both of you. Let's just say we get the ceasefire done and the hostages are released. What does it look like for Israel? What does it look like for Gaza? What is the hope moving forward?
For Gaza, you would need, obviously, like the hostages released, a ceasefire deal. You would need aid to literally flow in there in numbers that we have not seen aid flowing in before. You would need a Marshall Plan-esque sort of strategy moving forward. You would need some sort of an international peacekeeping force, Arab-led, to start securing it, because you also have this added problem of rule of law has been eradicated completely, and you get the sense that Gaza is very much sort of on the edge of deliberately orchestrated
What about
anarchy.
coexisting?
The vast majority of Palestinians that I have spoken to have no problem with the concept of coexistence, as long as they also are afforded the same rights and opportunities and a life of dignity. Because we also have to remember that even these great deals that Palestinians have been given, even the best ones, were still, quote, less than a state.
So in 2000, Yasser Arafat negotiated with Ehud Barak, who at the time was leading the most left-wing, most pro-peace, most pro-coexistence government in Israel's history. Bill Clinton was, mediating the two. Israel offered the Palestinians the West Bank, Gaza, 90% of the West Bank, all of the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem as a Palestinian state's capital. That was a state. Bill Clinton says Yasser Arafat walked out of that deal, and between 2000 and 2005, we had about 1,000 Israelis killed, almost 3,000 Palestinians killed in the Second Intifada. To this day, most Israelis do not understand why the Palestinians launched this suicide bombing campaign in major cities in Israel after Israel just tried to hand them a Palestinian state. So part of the story that you're saying, there's a story that Palestinians are trying to understand, there's a story Israelis are trying to understand, which is, can you coexist with us? Can you live with us? Can we actually live side by side? Because it's not only opportunities to get your own state that have been rejected, but the tone and the tenor and the rhetoric has always been about the disappearance of an Israeli state, of a Jewish state. And so that, to me, is, it's what story the Palestinians are not only telling themselves, but what are they saying to Israel? Because this whole point about coexistence, I'm hearing it from you. I'm not hearing it from anybody else.
The flip side of that is also true, though, right? Like, what stories are Israelis telling themselves? And here's what's actually sort of sad, but also kind of, interesting. If you shut your eyes and you listen to what a Palestinian or an Israeli is saying about fear of annihilation, about an inability to coexist, about, the other wanting to kill you and destroy you, if you don't actually look at who's talking, they're saying the exact same thing. There is a lot of intergenerational, very ingrained fear that is very valid on both sides.
And trauma.
Yeah.
The trauma, massive on both sides, historic trauma.
I do think it's important to keep in mind this is a trauma, and both societies are shattered.
For sure.
It's also one front in a seven-front war, at least from Israel's perspective, and the Palestinians, tragically to me, have been pawns in Iran's war to become the hegemonic power in the Middle East. And so talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a vacuum without thinking about this broader war, that basically Hamas has been a proxy of Iran's, like Hezbollah has been a proxy of Iran's, and it's just a broader geopolitical reality that I think we need to...
Arwa, in closing here and in giving you the final word, I'm curious if we can bring it back to what Americans should root for. And I should say that I know what I root for, and that's peace in the region, not only for the Palestinians and for the Israelis, but for my own two children who, as you know, Dan, and some of our viewers will remember, are half Israeli and live in Tel Aviv, right? So what should people who are watching this all unfold be rooting for to happen next?
A ceasefire, 100% a ceasefire, and a very robust effort to bring in aid. Because there's something else that I think we should point out before ending this conversation, is that if we look at Iraq's history, and we look at sort of the trajectory of where we went from having al-Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, every single time that the root cause of why a militant or terrorist organization is able to grow, become more violent, become more vicious, if that root cause is not eradicated, there's always something that comes next.
Yeah. Thank you both for breaking down all of these layers of this conversation, the complexity, and also talking about where there is common ground. This conversation is going to continue, but we're going to move on
and
right now.
And talking to each other so civilly. It was a beautiful thing. Thank you, guys.
Arwa Damon, Dan Senor, thank you so much.